Hi everyone, welcome to Difference Frames the World, a permanently demonetized channel to review world affairs from a different perspective. Even though we have been ineligible for monetization for over a year, we still do our best to keep the channel alive despite long-lasting difficulties. We need to thank our supporters for helping us keep DFTW alive for such a long time, and particularly, we extend our great thanks to Sherry, Mr. Wong, Donut, Richard, and Thomas, to name a few, for their continuous help. The Chinese New Year, Spring Festival, has come, and hundreds of millions of people are moving across the country to visit their families and friends. One top concern is whether China's COVID situation will worsen after the Spring Festival. According to official data, over 2 billion tickets have already been sold in China mainland. Many Chinese tourists also go abroad, but some countries do not greet and welcome them politely. Among those are Japan and South Korea, two followers of the United States. South Korea first required passengers from China to wear yellow identification cards to distinguish them from those from other countries. Secondly, it required them to be tested at a nucleic acid sampling site. Those who tested positive would be taken to a quarantine point in deplorable conditions. It is said that they could only lie on the ground, which is discriminatory and insulting. In response, China took reciprocal retaliatory measures. According to the Chinese embassy in South Korea, from January 10, the Chinese embassy in South Korea suspended the issuance of short-term visas to South Korean citizens. On January 24, a Chinese passenger detained for evading the quarantine was deported and restricted from entering South Korea for 1 year. According to a local news agency report, the above-mentioned Chinese passenger arrived at Incheon International Airport from China on January 3, 2023, and was arrested in downtown Seoul on the 5th after he tested positive for nucleic acid and needed to be quarantined after entering the country. The police investigated him for allegedly violating laws related to the prevention and management of infectious diseases, and he was later sent for prosecution. Since his case did not meet the conditions for arrest, the South Korean immigration authorities issued a forced deportation, without a separate trial. When most countries, including China, loosened the control and prevention measures, South Korea ill-treated visitors from China like prisoners. It is worth asking whether South Korea ever did this to Americans and Europeans when millions died during the pandemic. Why was South Korea so afraid of passengers from China? We cannot rule out the possibility of political maneuvers. Many other countries, like Thailand and Indonesia, have shown their wholehearted welcome to Chinese tourists. Why aren't they not afraid? China is the same, but it is different in the eyes of politicians. Today we want to update our viewers on China's COVID situation, after Beijing decided to give up its zero-COVID policy that had been implemented for nearly 3 years since early 2020. On January 14, 2023, at a press conference on the State Council's Joint Prevention and Control Mechanism, Jiao Yahui, Director General of the Medical Department of the National Health and Wellness Commission, introduced that from December 8, 2022, to January 12, 2023, there had been almost 60,000 COVID deaths reported in China's hospitals. It is noteworthy that the numbers do not reflect all COVID-19 deaths, as those not hospitalized might not have been included. Still, it is close to reality, as the country requires hospitals to issue death certificates before the dead are cremated. Before China gave up its zero-COVID policy in December 2022, some Western media had predicted that millions might die. When China had not eased its dynamic zero restrictions, they screamed for China not to control Chinese people's freedom by locking down infected areas. However, they became the most scared after China no longer implemented the stringent COVID measures. It proved Western media were wrong in predicting massive deaths related to COVID in China after December 2022. Less than 80,000 patients died in the country's mainland territory, and over 90% of deaths were aged people and those with underlying diseases. In March 2022, we predicted that China would have to open itself to the world as the Omicron variant is milder than other variants. However, we also said China would keep its zero-COVID policy before President Xi Jinping secured his third term. Our prediction was based on China's political environment in early 2022, and China's central government did loosen its COVID control and prevention measures after President Xi Jinping successfully won his third term. In this regard, China's zero-COVID policy served as a tool to maintain social and political stability. Nonetheless, the main reason China continued its dynamic zero policy was to protect aged people and those with underlying diseases. China successfully defeated COVID in 2020 and 2021, so when Omicron became the dominant variant in 2022, it still believed it could stop the spread as it had contained other variants. Omicron proved more infectious than expected, and China's strict measures failed, although the Chinese government is reluctant to admit it. The second day after China abandoned its zero-COVID policy, a city in Shandong province, Qingdao, announced that there had been nearly 500,000 infections in the city within a day. It was an unprecedentedly high number of infections reported in China mainland. Before China officially gave up its zero-COVID policy, no one had revealed such a shocking number. In a video published in the middle of 2020, we compared the COVID situation in the United States and China. We mentioned that China had removed over 3,000 local officials in Hubei province. Since then, local governments have implemented stricter control and prevention measures than required by the central government. Even after the central government abandoned the zero-COVID policy, local governments still took stringent efforts. The White Paper Revolution, widely reported in Western mainstream media, reflected that most Chinese people had been tired of the endless lockdowns in the past 3 years. There are around 200 countries worldwide, and China was one of the few, if not the only, that still refused to coexist with the virus. China's economy was adversely affected, and many could not earn enough money to sustain themselves. If China had not given up its zero-COVID policy, there would have been severe economic and political issues threatening its stability. In many videos, we pointed out that China needs to develop its economy fast to cover its social problems, especially in 2022. The world has moved on and has been coexisting with the new coronavirus for over a year. China would risk losing competitiveness if it still implemented the stringent dynamic zero policy. Many Chinese companies suffered unbearable losses in 2022, and many multinational corporations transferred their productions to Vietnam, India, and other emerging countries. Beijing was in a dilemma. It had to decide whether it should continue the zero-COVID policy or abandon it to save its economy. Unlike the US and Canada, China never provided material support to its citizens, even if they had no or limited income during lockdowns. Residents in locked communities had to pay extremely high prices for vegetables and fruits. If the central government had not openly given up its zero-COVID policy, local governments would have put more stringent controls, which might cause social instability, turmoil, and unrest. Some participants in the White Paper Revolution even urged the Communist Party and President Xi Jinping to step down. Although China announced the White Paper Revolution was illegal and detained some people, it helped expedite the abolition of the dynamic zero policy, which had been in place for nearly 3 years. Still, the most crucial reason for China to give up the dynamic zero policy is that the Omicron variant and its subvariants are not fatal as Delta, Alpha, and others. Most patients have minor or no symptoms, the death rate is below 0.2%, and 90% of deaths are related to the old population or those with underlying issues like heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. The focus of epidemic prevention and control in China has changed from preventing infection to protecting vulnerable people, particularly those elderly patients. The first wave of nationwide infections was almost over, as more than 1 billion people have acquired the virus in the past month. Even if there is a second wave, it will not be as severe. On January 25, China published its COVID cases and deaths in the past weeks in December 2022 and January 2023, which predicts the end of the first COVID attack after Beijing removed all its limitations. On January 23, 2023, there were 248,000 hospitalized COVID patients, an 85% reduction from the peak on January 5, when over 1.6 million patients flooded hundreds of thousands of hospitals in the country's mainland territory. The curve of COVID deaths in the past 2 months also revealed the light at the end of the tunnel. After January 5, deaths dropped below 1,000 a day, a reduction of nearly 80% on January 23. China has more than 1.4 billion people, and 1.1 billion have allegedly contracted the virus. Still, less than 80,000 people died, translating into a 0.01% death rate. Suppose China had given up its zero-COVID policy in early 2020 and had not locked down Wuhan, and 1.1 billion people had contracted the new coronavirus when the death rate was still around 10 to 15%. In that case, millions of Chinese, young or old, should have died. Despite various problems caused by the country's zero-COVID policy in the past 3 years, the Chinese government's dynamic zero policy effectively protected 1.4 billion Chinese mainlanders and millions of visitors against fatal strains like Delta and Alpha, which have killed millions outside China. China's zero-COVID policy is over. It has not only protected hundreds of millions of people during the pandemic, but also acted as a rehearsal for China to deal with the biochemical war in the future. If there were a global bacteria war some years later, China would be one of the few that could win that war, if not the only one. The pandemic will become endemic shortly, and the world economy is rebooting. China is now shifting from disease control and prevention to economic development, which will benefit the whole world, not merely 1.4 billion Chinese people. At the end of the video, we sincerely thank supporters for keeping DFTW alive after 1 year of demonetization. DFTW will not disappear.